secret base, destroying part of the perimeter. The military launched a drone to understand what had happened, but as soon as the device descended underground, it revealed something no one had ever suspected. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The morning began like countless others on the isolated stretch of desert where the airbase stood, a place so far removed from ordinary life that even the sun seemed to rise differently, dragging its light slowly over the sand as if reluctant to touch the metal and concrete of the military installation. The base had awakened in its usual rhythm, with patrol vehicles already making their methodical rounds and maintenance crews preparing aircraft for the day's operations. The desert air held a cool sharpness that would soon give way to blistering heat, but for now it carried only the hum of distant turbines and the faint clatter of tools from open hangars. Within the perimeter, soldiers took their positions with mechanical discipline, exchanging brief greetings as shifts rotated. Everything had the feeling of predictable routine, the kind of structured monotony that came from years of unchanged procedure. Out on the tarmac, a handful of armored vehicles rested in their designated spots, some awaiting transport, others scheduled for inspection. Nearby, a small training jet stood secured in place, its technicians performing routine checks. Nothing in the scene suggested anything unusual. Nothing hinted at the moment that would fracture the morning and rewrite the day's purpose entirely. The first sign that something was wrong arrived almost imperceptibly, a tremor so faint it could have been mistaken for an engine ignition. A few pebbles skittered across the hard ground, a wrench clinked against a toolbox, and several personnel paused just long enough to glance at their surroundings before returning to their tasks. Then the vibration deepened. It rolled upward from beneath the concrete instead of through the air, a low and unnatural rumble that grew thicker and louder, as though some giant hidden just below the surface were shifting in its sleep. A technician near the training jet dropped his clipboard when the ground jolted sharply under his boots. The vibration became a violent shudder that knocked dust from ceiling pipes in the maintenance bay. The sound was not like an explosion, nor like distant thunder, but something in between, an overwhelming groan of earth under sudden strain. In the open area near the parked vehicles, the concrete began to fracture, long hairline cracks racing outward like lightning across a stormy sky. Soldiers shouted warnings as the ground swelled, then collapsed inward in a catastrophic ripple. The surface broke apart in several places at once, collapsing into a massive chasm that yawned open with terrifying force. The soil and concrete did not fall smoothly but crumbled in uneven slabs, creating a vortex of debris that tumbled downward. The armored vehicle closest to the center of the collapse lost its footing and slid toward the widening pit, its tires straining for grip on the crumbling surface. It hung for a second on a slanted piece of pavement, then tipped, metal shrieking as it plunged into the deepening void. Behind it, the truck carrying ammunition attempted to reverse, but the pavement under its rear wheels broke away. The driver barely escaped through his door before the vehicle pitched forward and disappeared into the swirling dust. The training jet fared no better. Its rear landing gear sank through the cracked surface, and the tilted fuselage tore free of its restraints. The nose pointed skyward for an instant before the weight imbalance pulled it back, sliding into the sinkhole until only the tail protruded above the dusty air, like the final marker of a swallowed monument. The ground continued collapsing for several long, horrible seconds before settling into an uneasy stillness, leaving behind an immense crater and the faint echo of destruction. The base reacted instantly. Klaxons blared across the complex, red warning lights flashed on poles around the perimeter, and automated alerts flooded the internal communication network. Soldiers rushed into formation as emergency protocols triggered lockdown procedures. Access roads leading toward the collapse zone were sealed within minutes as armored barriers snapped into place. The air filled with the sound of orders shouted over the din, each command carrying urgency, but also the practiced precision of personnel trained to withstand crisis. The dust cloud from the collapse lingered in the air, thick enough to partially obscure the jagged edge of the crater, which stretched wide enough to shock even the seasoned engineers arriving on scene. Senior officers converged on the site with the first wave of responders, their vehicles braking abruptly as they reached the unstable perimeter. The crater dominated the landscape like a wound ripped open in the earth. Its edges sloped sharply downward, a chaotic mixture of broken concrete slabs, twisted rebar, collapsed asphalt, and exposed earth. The walls of the sinkhole appeared uneven, some sections collapsing into natural formations, others revealing straight surfaces and metallic elements that had no business being beneath the base. From certain angles, the edges gleamed in the sunlight where metal had been torn cleanly by sudden pressure, not by natural geological forces. Engineers cautiously approached the lip, staying well back from the crumbling edges as they assessed the risk of further collapse. Several sections of the wall displayed disturbingly regular shapes, as though vertical spaces had been carved underground. One of the officers questioned whether the crater had intersected a previously unknown storage space or an abandoned structure from an older phase of the base, but the engineers quickly dismissed that idea. No such chamber appeared in any record. Whatever lay beneath them had not been built by the military. The realization settled heavily among those gathered at the scene. With the dust still trailing through the air, the commanding officer requested immediate deployment of reconnaissance tools. Ground-penetrating sensors were set up, and a compact drone designed for subterranean inspection was prepared for descent. Technicians synchronized its cameras and signal boosters, confirming that the tether line was secured. The device was then lowered carefully into the chasm, its lights casting stark beams across the jagged surfaces. The live feed displayed on handheld monitors revealed eerie layers of broken structure, as if the collapse had peeled back the earth to uncover hidden passages. The deeper the drone traveled, the stranger the formations became. The walls shifted from raw soil and fractured concrete to patterns that suggested deliberate construction. Smooth, vertical lines, symmetrically placed support beams, segments that resembled reinforced tunnel struts. The team exchanged uneasy glances as the drone drifted toward what appeared to be the entrance of a horizontal passage carved into the wall of the sinkhole. The structure was unmistakably artificial, built with a consistency and precision that only human hands and modern tools could achieve. The drone descended further, passing through the opening, its lights illuminating the unmistakable interior of a man-made tunnel. The walls were lined with reinforced supports that looked neither decayed nor aged. In fact, they appeared relatively new. Dust clung to them, but there were no signs of rust or erosion. It was a construction far too recent to belong to any archived infrastructure. At approximately 60 meters below the surface, the drone's feed flickered. The image distorted, vanishing into a haze of static. Technicians attempted to re-establish signal, switching frequencies and toggling the boosters, but nothing restored the connection. The drone had not crashed. Its tether line remained taut, suggesting it still hung freely in the void. Yet the signal was gone, cut off abruptly as though something below had interfered with it. The engineers exchanged alarmed looks. A natural obstruction could cause interference, but a complete and sudden blackout, especially one occurring the moment the drone entered deeper into the tunnel, suggested the presence of either shielding materials or an active blocking device. The commanding officer studied the last frozen frame of the video feed, which captured a sliver of the tunnel's interior before the blackout. The image lingered with unsettling clarity. A smooth, reinforced passageway stretching into darkness, built with deliberate intent, offering no clue as to who had carved it or for what purpose. The implications were immediate and troubling. Something was beneath the base, something that no official documentation acknowledged, and the collapse had exposed it only by accident. The decision to send personnel down for a physical inspection came quickly. The scale of the collapse, the mysterious tunnel, and the sudden loss of the drone signal demanded a direct investigation. Already, soldiers were establishing a wider exclusion zone around the sinkhole, ensuring that no unauthorized individuals approached the scene. Equipment for a manned descent was prepared, ropes and harnesses fitted, environmental sensors calibrated. The base's routine had been shattered, replaced by a heightened tension that threaded through every movement of the personnel. The morning that had begun with quiet routine had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos, with the crater at its center pulling everyone's focus toward the unknown. From the edge of the chasm, the commanding officer looked down into the dim, jagged depths, aware that whatever waited in the darkness was far more complex than a simple geological failure. The collapse had uncovered a hidden world beneath the base, one that someone had built with purpose and secrecy. As dust settled and preparations for descent continued, a single thought pressed upon him with growing weight. This was not the end of the mystery. This was merely the beginning. The preparations for the descent began almost immediately after the drone's signal vanished, as though the abrupt silence from below had swept the last traces of hesitation from the minds of those responsible for the investigation. The crater remained disturbingly still, as if it were holding its breath, the sunlight falling weakly across the jagged layers of broken earth and metal. Engineers, soldiers, and specialized rescue personnel moved with controlled urgency, their movements guided by decades-old emergency procedures that had never anticipated a situation quite like this one. The air retained a faint mixture of dust and the unsettled tension of a base that had only begun to understand the enormity of what had just been uncovered. Orders traveled quickly across radios, each crisp and urgent, echoing over the hum of machinery being unpacked near the crater's edge. While teams secured the perimeter, a specialized unit assembled the equipment required for a manned descent. Harnesses were laid out, adjusted, and tested with methodical precision. Heavy-duty ropes were checked, rechecked, and anchored into reinforced steel fixtures newly drilled into stable ground outside the radius of collapse. Environmental monitors were calibrated to measure air composition in the depths below, a necessary precaution when facing unknown subterranean spaces. The base's medical team waited on standby within eyesight of the sinkhole, prepared for anything from toxic gas exposure to structural failure. Every motion carried the weight of uncertainty, for no one knew what lay beneath the surface or what risks awaited the first team to step into that darkness. Once the final safety checks were completed, the first descent team gathered near the edge. They exchanged brief glances, not of fear, but of acknowledgement. This was the kind of moment that defined their purpose. As they moved into position and secured their harnesses, the air grew heavier, as though the crater itself radiated an invisible gravity. The commanding officer, still reviewing the last frozen image from the drone's feed, gave the final nod. The team began their descent, lowering themselves carefully along the uneven walls of the sinkhole, their boots occasionally striking loose stones that tumbled down ahead of them into the shadows. The sunlight faded as the team progressed downward, replaced by the artificial beams of their helmets cutting narrow paths through the lingering dust. The depth became more apparent with every meter. Broken layers of concrete, once thick reinforced slabs, and twisted bars of metal jutted from the walls like ribs of some vast, buried structure torn apart by collapse. The deeper they went, the more the silence pressed in around them, broken only by the scrape of their gear against the walls and the faint echo of falling debris. By the time they reached the ledge where the drone had last transmitted, the sinkhole was a distant bowl of light above them, unable to reach the cavernous hollow below. The entrance to the horizontal tunnel revealed itself with far greater clarity now that the team stood before it. Even in the dim beam of their lights, the edges of the passage were sharp and deliberate, cut into the earth with unmistakable intention. The walls bore signs of modern excavation equipment, not the crude marks of old tools, but clean, deliberate surfaces supported by recently installed metal frames. Dust coated everything uniformly, yet there were no signs of age. The supports showed no rust. The bolts looked almost new. The tunnel had not been here for decades, or even many years. It had been constructed recently, so recently that several of the team members exchanged uneasy looks, each arriving at the same silent conclusion without words. The air inside the passage felt different, as though it carried a subtle chill that did not match the heat rising from the desert above. The team stepped inside cautiously, their lights revealing a straight path that extended far beyond what the drone had captured before the signal vanished. The ground showed signs of frequent use, boot prints pressed into the fine dust, tracks resembling those of narrow cart wheels, and subtle indentations that suggested heavy loads had been dragged or wheeled deeper into the earth. The distribution of dust itself told a story. Some areas were evenly layered, untouched for days perhaps, while others revealed fresh disturbances where movement had occurred more recently. These traces did not belong to animals or natural shifts. They were purposeful human signatures. As the team progressed deeper, the tunnel widened slightly. They observed how the reinforcement beams were arranged with an engineer's logic, installed at calculated intervals to support the weight of the earth overhead. The mere existence of such a structure beneath a military base without documentation was astonishing. The team members spoke sparingly, each aware that even a whisper echoed strangely in the confined space. The silence was not merely absence of sound. It felt charged, filled with the weight of secrecy and the sensation of being somewhere no one was meant to enter. It did not take long before they discovered the first hidden chamber. One of the technicians noticed a faintly outlined rectangular shape along the right wall, a surface that did not match the surrounding stone. Closer inspection revealed it to be a concealed panel fashioned from composite material and coated with a thin layer of dust for camouflage. When they pried it open, it swung inward effortlessly, as though it had been maintained recently. Behind it lay a compact room, large enough for several people to work in or store equipment. Shelves lined the walls, holding sealed containers stacked with an almost obsessive sense of organization. No military markings adorned them. Instead, they bore blank labels, or none at all, a detail that immediately raised suspicions. Opening the containers revealed their contents: ammunition boxes filled with rounds of various calibers, industrial-strength tools, oxygen tanks, coiled ropes, and heavy-duty construction equipment. There were portable generators, fuel canisters, and ventilation fans designed for underground use. The equipment was civilian in origin, but the breadth and arrangement suggested more than casual use. Everything implied prolonged activity, foresight, and a large-scale operation executed with secrecy in mind. The discovery lent a chilling validity to the theory that someone had constructed this network deliberately and systematically. The team moved on through the tunnel, their pace steady but increasingly wary. The farther they went, the stronger the impression became that the corridor had served as an artery for continuous movement. The boot prints and wheel tracks continued, sometimes overlapping but consistently directed toward the depths ahead. At certain points, the tunnel intersected with older structures, relics from previous decades of base development. These passages bore the signature of an earlier era, with rusted metal, faded stenciling, and outdated fixtures from forgotten infrastructure projects. The newer tunnel passed through these older cavities seamlessly, incorporating their space when useful and bypassing them when not. Whoever built this system had access to information beyond public or military record, possessing knowledge of obsolete tunnels long lost to official documentation. The air thickened slightly as the team ventured deeper, and the faint hum of machinery stirred in the distance, a sound too controlled to be geological. When they encountered a widening of the corridor ahead, they paused before entering the next area. The space beyond opened into a chamber far larger than the first hidden room, suggesting this was a central point within the network. The walls were lined with black cables running in parallel, feeding into portable generators placed atop reinforced platforms. Papers, tools, and bits of packaging littered the floor as though abandoned in haste. The room had clearly served as an underground operations center. Maps and diagrams were affixed to the walls, illuminated by the team's flashlights. As the lights passed over them, the outlines of strategic routes became visible. Paths marked in red, blue, and black, some forming concentric reference points around the perimeter of the very base above, others reaching outward toward sectors that were unmistakably part of the restricted area belonging to the notorious Zone 51. The maps were detailed, containing topographical indicators, estimated sensor locations, and notations regarding geological density in certain regions. It did not take long to notice that the tunnel they now stood in was drawn on several maps, marked as a primary approach route toward one specific location within the adjacent restricted zone. Papers scattered across makeshift desks showed calculations of load-bearing capacity, depth measurements, air circulation plans, and notes related to excavation progress. Some carried signs of repeated revisions, lines crossed out, new measurements scribbled in the margins. It was evident that the builders had adapted their plans again and again as they worked deeper, adjusting for unexpected rock formations or changes in soil consistency. This was not the work of amateurs or casual trespassers. It was a carefully orchestrated operation, executed by individuals who possessed both technical knowledge and a clear, unwavering objective. As the team continued to explore this underground command point, they realized the operation must have involved multiple people working systematically for months. The network of tunnels, the hidden storage rooms, the improvised command center, and the meticulous notes all pointed to a level of planning that rivaled military operations. Yet, the absence of any official record meant these builders were acting entirely outside the law, beneath the feet of one of the most secure military installations in the country. The deeper truth was beginning to emerge, unsettling and undeniable. Someone had not simply created a tunnel beneath the airbase, they had carved a pathway aimed directly toward one of the most restricted and secretive facilities in the United States. The discovery of this base of operations added overwhelming weight to the mystery, raising the stakes for whatever the team might find next. The team members exchanged glances that revealed the same growing awareness. This tunnel was not an isolated act. It was a deliberate attempt to infiltrate a place not meant to be entered, a place that had been shielded for decades by secrecy, speculation, and layers of defense. Whatever had compelled the builders to risk constructing such an elaborate route into forbidden territory remained unknown, but the scope of their ambition was unmistakable. The team pressed on, following the tunnel's descent deeper underground. The sense of danger sharpened not just because of the physical risks of collapse or structural instability, but because they now walked through a structure that represented a direct violation of national security. The mystery from above had led them here, and the path ahead promised only more disturbing revelations. The collapse of the ground had exposed not just a sinkhole, but the threshold of a hidden world carved in defiance of every barrier meant to keep intruders out. The deeper they went, the clearer it became that this discovery was neither accidental nor isolated. It was part of something far greater, and the truth of it waited in the dark ahead. The deeper the team moved into the tunnel, the more the atmosphere changed around them. What had begun as a cautious descent into a damaged cavity beneath the base had turned into a journey through a hidden structure of staggering ambition. The air grew denser, not with dust alone, but with the weight of secrecy, the sense that every new corridor they entered had been created with a purpose no one had anticipated at dawn that morning. Their lights pierced the darkness ahead, revealing only narrow cones of vision, while everything outside those beams felt watchful and alive. The silence, broken only by the faint hum of machinery carried from somewhere deeper in the complex, gave the impression that the builders of this place had only just stepped out, leaving their work unfinished but not abandoned. The team reached a section of the tunnel where the walls curved more gradually and the ground beneath their boots sloped downward in a smooth, engineered gradient. This was no accidental shape. It reflected an understanding of load distribution and stress, the kind of calculation that came from someone who knew how to carve tunnels that could withstand significant pressure. Yet, as they continued forward, they entered a stretch where the tunnel's structural regularity abruptly fragmented. The smooth surface of the walls gave way to jagged breaks where beams had bent inward or snapped altogether. Large sections of compacted earth had spilled into the passage, some piled high enough to force the team to step over debris or squeeze through narrow gaps. The air felt heavier here, tinged with the smell of disturbed soil and exposed minerals. It became clear that they had reached the area directly beneath the sinkhole. The devastation of the collapse expressed itself in the twisted remains of the tunnel's supports. Metal beams that once stood vertical had buckled under the weight, some folded into grotesque shapes, others torn free entirely and scattered along the floor like discarded limbs. The ground above had sheared downward with such force that entire sections of the ceiling had broken loose, leaving only remnants of what had once been a carefully reinforced corridor. The team paused here, taken in the sight. This was the point at which the tunnel's designers had made their fatal miscalculation. The widening of the chamber, begun without reinforcing the surrounding earth adequately, had triggered a chain reaction. The supports had not been designed to handle the enormous strain created by the expanding cavity, and the ground overhead had collapsed with crushing finality. From where they stood, the faint edge of sunlight filtering down from the distant sinkhole above reminded them just how fragile the barrier between the surface and this subterranean world could be. The collapse, though catastrophic for the base, had been merely the byproduct of a hidden project much larger in scale. Had the builders managed to reinforce the chamber correctly or pace their excavation more cautiously, the base might never have discovered what lay below. The thought lingered in the minds of the team as they surveyed the ruined section with a mixture of awe and unease. The collapse had stopped the builders, but it had also brought their work into the light. Beyond the ruined section, the tunnel widened into a different kind of passage, one that bore signs of being carved around pre-existing structures. The walls transitioned from newer smooth surfaces to older, rougher textures marked with discoloration and faint paint patterns worn over time. The team's lights revealed metal struts corroded with age, bricks chipped and discolored, and conduits running unevenly along the walls in ways that no modern engineer would design. These were remnants from an era long past, perhaps dating back to the height of the Cold War, when the military had constructed extensive underground networks for infrastructure that had later been sealed, abandoned, or forgotten. The team moved cautiously through this patchwork of old and new. The older structures intersected with the new tunnel at irregular intervals, creating a labyrinthine mixture of temporal layers. In some places, the new excavators had simply broken through old walls, leaving jagged outlines that revealed forgotten spaces behind them. In others, they had incorporated old chambers directly into their design, using them as shortcuts or natural expansions in the network. The careful choice to integrate these long-lost passages rather than avoid them suggested access to historical schematics that were no longer part of the base's active archives. Whoever built this network knew more than any civilian should know, and possibly more than many within the military itself. As the team ventured deeper into one of the larger intersecting chambers, they found signs that the builders had turned this place into a central hub. The ceiling rose high above them, forming a vaulted dome supported by heavy crossbeams. A faint but noticeable scent of fuel and electricity hung in the air. The floor showed patches where tools had scraped, where heavy equipment had been dragged, and where footprints, countless footprints, had passed. Against the far wall stood portable generators, some still warm, their cables snaking outward like veins across the floor. Fuel cans lay nearby, some half full, others empty. The remains of food wrappers, emptied water bottles, and other human traces suggested that people had not only worked here, but had spent long amounts of time underground. Tables made of scavenged materials held piles of documents weighted down by rocks and tools to keep them from sliding. The papers bore calculations, schematics, and diagrams. As the team shone their lights over these documents, the images sharpened into recognizable forms. Floor plans, topographical cross-sections, and detailed maps of restricted zones. Bold lines cut across the maps indicating potential pathways, angles of approach, and weak points in structural fortification. Several maps depicted the region surrounding the base with astonishing precision, showing not only the outer boundary but also sections of underground infrastructure rarely shown outside classified channels. One map in particular featured an unmistakable outline, the perimeter of Zone 51, marked in meticulous detail. This discovery confirmed everything the team had suspected. The tunnel was not simply a geological accident or the project of rogue trespassers seeking thrill. It was a deliberate construction intended to lead into one of the most secure and mythologized facilities in the nation. The scale of preparation visible here spoke volumes. The builders understood the patrol rotations, the density of bedrock, the types of motion sensors likely used in the restricted area. They had calculated angles to avoid seismic detectors and had plotted their course through the least monitored sections of terrain. They knew the old infrastructure well enough to exploit forgotten segments and integrate them into their route. The more they examined the materials on the tables, the clearer the timeline appeared. The project had evolved over many months. Early sketches showed a rough outline of the tunnel far shorter and less sophisticated. Later, diagrams displayed corrections, changes in direction, and newly added branches. Some notes described unexpected encounters with harder rock or water pockets, leading to rerouting. Other notes mentioned older tunnels discovered by accident during the excavation. With each revision, the builders adjusted their strategy to optimize the path toward their final destination, a subterranean section of Zone 51, whose exact purpose remained unknown, even to the team now observing the documents. The realization that civilians, radical ones at that, had successfully built a complex, covert system beneath a military base without being detected was unsettling for every member of the team. It was a kind of violation that went beyond the physical breach of the Earth. It represented a breach of security, of vigilance, of the very assumptions that structured the base's operations. The outside world had always speculated about what lay beneath Zone 51. Conspiracy forums were clogged with theories ranging from extraterrestrial research to secret weapons hidden underground. But the builders of this tunnel had taken that speculation to extremes, transforming it into a mission that combined paranoid ideology with reckless determination. The artifacts in this underground headquarters revealed layers of obsession, conviction, and resourcefulness. As the team absorbed the scale of what the builders had achieved, they could not help but feel a sense of proximity, not just in space, but in time. These documents had not gathered dust for years. The ink was fresh, the tools well maintained, and the generators still held warmth from recent use. Somewhere in this subterranean labyrinth, the people who built it had worked tirelessly, and perhaps were even nearby before the collapse forced them to flee. The sense of their presence lingered in the stale air, a ghostly reminder of how close the two groups had come to crossing paths. The chamber's exit led into another tunnel that sloped further downward, drawing the team deeper into the secretive underworld the builders had carved. As they walked, the evidence of planning continued. The new tunnel here appeared more refined than earlier sections, displaying fewer signs of improvisation. The supports were evenly spaced, and the air was noticeably fresher, suggesting functioning ventilation further down the line. The smoothness of the floor told them that heavy transport had likely passed through recently. The team members could not ignore the sensation of being watched, not by people, but by the intentions embedded in the very stone and metal around them. Every beam, every reinforced segment, every cable felt like a voice whispering in the dark. Someone intended to go much deeper than this. The tunnel grew warmer as they advanced, the hum of machinery becoming more consistent. The team realized they were approaching something significant, another junction or perhaps a second hub of activity. Their lights swept ahead, catching glimpses of more support beams and the unnatural symmetry of a deliberately crafted passageway. The mystery deepened with every step they took. The collapse that had torn open the earth above had revealed only the surface of a far more intricate and dangerous undertaking. The world beneath the airbase had transformed from an accidental sinkhole into a revelation of hidden architecture, a labyrinth built with purpose. The surface might have shown chaos, vehicles swallowed, ground ruptured, but below they now walked through corridors of intent. And the deeper they ventured, the clearer it became that the heart of this underground construction still lay ahead, waiting like a sealed chamber of secrets yet to be uncovered. The descent into the next stretch of the tunnel felt like crossing an invisible threshold, a point beyond which the air seemed heavier, the silence deeper, and the intentions of the builders unmistakably darker. What had begun as a hidden passage carved beneath a military base was now revealing itself to be something far more deliberate and dangerous. A path not merely toward secrecy, but toward destruction. The hum the team had heard faintly in the previous chamber grew clearer as they progressed, resolving into a low mechanical vibration. It pulsed through the reinforced walls, a rhythmic reminder that somewhere ahead, machines still operated, still served a purpose even after their operators had fled. The lights from the team's helmets cast long, wavering shadows that danced unnaturally along the metal supports, and at times it felt as if the shadows moved with intent rather than by the laws of physics. The corridor sloped downward in a gradual descent, engineered with a precision that made clear the builders had intended to transport heavy equipment through it. The floor bore signs of repeated movement. Fine dust smeared into darkened streaks from the friction of cartwheels and narrow gouges suggested that boxes or machinery had been dragged through during periods when speed mattered more than caution. The air carried a faint, artificial dryness, like the sterile breeze emitted by underground ventilation. The team followed this subtle current deeper, the sense of purpose embedded in the path sharpening with every step they took. As they rounded a bend, the tunnel's walls widened again, and the chamber that opened before them was larger than any they had encountered so far. The space rose higher than the beams of their lights could fully reveal. The echoes of their footsteps lingered far longer than expected, bouncing against surfaces they could not yet see. The room's faint odor was not one of decay, but something sterner and more chemical. Fuel vapors, metallic dust, and the cold tang of oxidized explosives barely concealed beneath layers of earth. When their lights swept across the first stacks of crates arranged with almost military precision, they realized what they had found. The crates stood in uniform rows, each identical in size and shape, constructed from reinforced composite materials and sealed with industrial clamps. Even before the team approached them, the markings, though mostly scraped off or obscured, gave subtle hints. The thickness of the crates, the reinforced edges, the distinctive clamps, all were features known to those who dealt with demolition materials. As the team's lights focused on the labels that had not been fully erased, they saw faint impressions where stenciled warnings had once been. The outlines of triangles, the ghostly remains of numerical codes, and an occasional partially scratched-out word were enough to confirm their suspicions. These crates contained high-grade explosives. The reality of this discovery settled over the team like a suffocating weight. There was no plausible scenario in which such quantities of demolition-grade material could exist beneath a military base without authorization. Someone had smuggled these materials into the subterranean labyrinth and done so in quantities large enough to devastate underground structures. The placement of the crates, stacked methodically, secured with precision, was not the work of amateurs. Whoever had planned this operation understood demolition tactics intimately, and they had intended to use these explosives not in isolated charges, but in a coordinated detonation designed to pierce through reinforced barriers. The team moved cautiously between the rows. Some crates had been opened, revealing their lethal contents. Blocks of stabilized explosives wrapped in protective casings, coils of detonation cord, bundles of shaped charges engineered to focus explosive force in precise directions. In several crates, components lay arranged in neat rows, as if prepared for assembly. Digital timers with rugged casings rested beside detonators, all dormant yet appearing fully operational. The equipment was clean, orderly, and meticulously organized, a chilling testament to how close the unknown group had come to executing their plan. Further into the chamber, the team discovered a section where complex wiring diagrams littered a makeshift table. The papers were covered in hand-drawn lines illustrating blast patterns and shockwave behavior, annotated with detailed calculations. Red arrows indicated the intended direction of concussive force. Blue lines marked structural weak points. Several sketches depicted the same target from different angles. A thick concrete wall reinforced with steel mesh and interconnected beams. The target was drawn repeatedly, each time with notes about angles, charge placement, and predicted breach dimensions. It was clear this wall was not part of the tunnel network but belonged to an entirely different structure deeper underground. Cross-referencing the map pinned beside the diagrams with their own knowledge of classified infrastructure, the team realized with dawning disbelief that the wall in question was part of the underground perimeter of Zone 51. The builders had intended not to explore or observe, but to force their way through the subterranean defenses of one of the most heavily guarded facilities in the country, and they had nearly completed the tools required for such an incursion. As the team ventured deeper into the chamber, the glow of abandoned work lights appeared ahead, their bulbs weak but still functional due to compact generators humming quietly nearby. The flickering lights cast hazy illumination across the floor, revealing an area where work had clearly been halted mid-preparation. Half-empty crates lay open, their contents scattered. Several shaped charges had been partially assembled. Detonation cords were unrolled but not connected. Someone had set up a workbench with clamps, pliers, and tools laid out neatly, yet the bench bore the unmistakable sign that its user had left in haste. The tools remained aligned, but the project lay incomplete, as though an urgent shout had forced them to abandon everything and flee. This impression was strengthened by the presence of a half-eaten ration bar sitting on the bench, one end bitten off, still in its wrapper. An overturned chair lay nearby, and its legs angled awkwardly as if knocked aside during a sudden exit. The flashlight on the ground, still on, though its battery was nearly dead, indicated that someone had dropped it without taking the time to retrieve it. The scene exuded an uncomfortable sense of immediacy. They had not left days ago. They had likely been here mere hours before the collapse above disrupted their operation. Among the papers scattered on a portable metal table were handwritten notes, scribbled in uneven script that revealed hurried thought rather than careful planning. Phrases leapt out from the pages with jarring clarity. Breach chamber, extraction window, truth vault, and confirm artifacts. Other pages contained lists of supplies, timelines for excavation, and projected schedules for detonations. One note in particular bore a phrase repeated more than once. They must know. The world must know. The conviction of the builders was evident even through these brief glimpses into their minds. They were not motivated by money, espionage, or sabotage. They were motivated by belief, a fanatical certainty that the government was hiding truths they were destined to reveal. The deeper the team moved into the room, the more evidence supported this conclusion. Stacks of printed articles from conspiracy websites were pinned to a makeshift corkboard. Photos of supposed sightings, diagrams of alien craft drawn by anonymous witnesses, and lists of alleged cover-ups cluttered the surface. Quotes from speakers known for promoting fringe theories had been underlined and highlighted. The ideological foundation of this operation was clear. The group believed that beneath Zone 51 were secrets about extraterrestrial life, secrets the government had concealed for decades. Their intention had been to uncover those secrets by force, using the explosives to create a breach large enough to access the subterranean chambers they imagined held alien artifacts or bodies. Some of the diagrams showed ambitious speculation, such as the interior layouts of supposed alien containment units or hypothetical vaults containing crash debris. None of these had any basis in classified reality, but the builders' meticulous preparation showed that they had fully embraced these theories. They had convinced themselves that the only way to expose the truth was to break through the secure underground barriers. Their certainty made their preparations even more alarming. They had been willing to risk massive damage, potential casualties, and a catastrophic breach to achieve their ideological goal. As the team explored the chamber's far corner, they found a large schematic pinned to the wall, a detailed side-view illustration of the underground infrastructure. It showed not only the tunnel network the intruders had carved, but also the portion of the subterranean perimeter where they planned the breach. This illustration was based on a combination of publicly available speculation and bits of classified knowledge the group must have somehow obtained. It showed the target area as a thick reinforced wall leading to what they believed was an interior vault of unprecedented secrecy. The truth, as the team knew, was far less sensational. They recognized the section of the diagram and understood that the real space beyond the wall housed old archival storage areas, maintenance tunnels, and sealed-off laboratories from decades past. There were no alien remains or exotic technologies, but the intruders did not know that. They had projected onto that space all the fantasies their movement had cultivated over years of online forums and clandestine meetings. Their breach would not have uncovered extraterrestrial mysteries. It would have resulted in destruction and chaos. The thought lingered heavily among the team as they stood in that chamber. The explosives would have cracked open structural sections not designed to withstand inward assault. Debris could have cascaded into adjacent areas, crushing old support systems and potentially causing collapses beyond the target zone. If the builders had succeeded, the consequences could have ranged from localized cave-ins to catastrophic structural failures affecting the integrity of the entire subterranean complex. The sensation of standing in the midst of such potential devastation left the team chilled. They had entered this tunnel expecting danger, but not this magnitude of threat, nor this kind of misguided fervor. The intruders were not military-trained operatives or foreign agents. They were civilians driven by ideology, radicalized by the belief that the government was hiding the truth from humanity. And, despite their lack of formal training, they had managed to build something that came dangerously close to breaching a restricted military zone. In the dim light of the chamber, amid crates of explosives, incomplete devices, and scattered remnants of hurried departure, the team recognized the full scale of what they had stumbled upon. The collapse above had halted the operation, but only by chance. Had the tunnel not given way, the builders might have completed their preparations and carried out the largest unauthorized subterranean incursion in the base's history. The team remained silent for several long moments, the gravity of the discovery settling into their bones. The machinery still hummed, the abandoned work lights flickered, and the air felt close and heavy, as though saturated with the intent left behind by those who had fled. The team knew that they had to continue deeper, that this chamber was not the end of the tunnel, but merely another waypoint in a path leading toward a confrontation with something even more complex. The minds behind this operation, the ideology that drove them, and the full extent of the threat they represented. The silence that settled over the chamber after the team finished examining the explosives felt heavier than the earth pressing down above them. The hum of the generators, the faint flicker of the dying work lights, the stale air, everything contributed to the suffocating realization of how close the base had come to facing a catastrophe engineered not by a foreign power or a rogue military faction, but by civilians driven by obsession. As the team moved away from the explosives room, no one spoke for a long while. The enormity of what they had found shadowed their steps, and every light beam cast across the tunnel walls seemed to reveal more evidence of a conspiracy that had been meticulously planned and executed beneath their feet. The tunnel ahead narrowed slightly, then curved, leading into a sloping passage that bore far fewer signs of collapse. The floor showed tracks that were clearer, less buried beneath dust, as though traffic here had been more frequent and more recent. Scattered footprints appeared in clusters, some deep and sharply defined, others fading into softer impressions. These overlapping patterns suggested numerous individuals had traveled this way repeatedly, forming a well-established path through the network. In places, the dust was disturbed in broad, sweeping arcs, the kind made when heavy objects are dragged or wheeled through with urgency. Each trace told a story of movement and purpose. No part of this tunnel had been idle. The deeper the team progressed, the more artifacts of everyday human presence they encountered. A strip of cloth snagged on a protruding beam, a broken clasp from a backpack, a discarded multi-tool lying near the wall. Someone had dropped a flashlight battery, which had rolled into a small crevice where it had lain undisturbed. Scattered debris formed a mosaic of habits and routines, the residues of long nights spent underground. Nothing here belonged to someone making a single reckless intrusion. Everything pointed to months, perhaps even more than a year of continuous work. The team followed the slope until it leveled into another broad chamber, though smaller than the explosives room. This space, however, bore an entirely different character. Rather than stacks of crates and diagrams for demolition, it was crowded with personal items and supplies that suggested people had used it not just as a workspace, but as a base of operations where they spent extended stretches of time. Sleeping rolls lay in the corners, still flattened as if they had been used recently. Pile after pile of empty water bottles formed small clusters abandoned hastily. A few aluminum food wrappers lay scattered, their edges torn open with impatience. There was even a portable stove, cooled and dark, but still smelling faintly of something chemical and artificial. A mug sat beside it, half filled with a liquid that had long since dried into a sticky smear. Everything in the room told the story of people who had not simply worked here. They had lived here. They had eaten underground, slept underground, planned and argued and scribbled ideas underground. The walls bore scratch marks where someone had repeatedly pushed furniture or equipment against them. In another corner, a stack of notebooks sat half-toppled over, pages bristling with handwritten notes. The team approached them cautiously, flipping through pages filled with dense writing, sketches, and symbols. The notebooks revealed the builders' minds with startling clarity. Some pages cataloged engineering calculations. Others contained hand-drawn maps of the tunnels, but integrated among these were deeply personal entries, fragments of thought, conviction, and paranoia. One notebook contained an entry written in hurried strokes, describing how the tunnels were the only way to bypass government surveillance. Another page held a manifesto-like statement. If we do not act, humanity will never learn what they hide beneath the desert. There were references to group meetings, secret gatherings, coded communication channels, and discussions about avoiding detection. It became tragically clear that the people behind this operation were not hardened criminals or trained infiltrators. They were ordinary individuals who had drifted far from reason, pushed by conspiracy-driven ideologies into believing that they had a moral obligation to expose secrets that did not exist. Their writing revealed fear. Fear of being discovered, fear of betrayal, fear of the government's imagined power. But it also revealed a shared sense of destiny. They saw themselves as heroes of a cause, compelled to risk everything for a truth they had convinced themselves was hidden behind the walls of the restricted zone. The team continued through the room, collecting samples and scanning for anything that might identify the individuals involved. They found pieces of clothing with worn tags, personal hygiene items, fragments of packaging from common stores, and scribbled shopping lists tucked between pages of a notebook. There was not a single item of military-grade equipment. Everything was store-bought or improvised. The radios they found were inexpensive civilian models. The headlamps and batteries were of the type sold in camping supply stores. Even the survival tools were mass-market products. Nothing indicated professional training or sophisticated backing. They were simply resourceful individuals driven by obsession. The room also contained large bags with excavation tools, shovels caked in dried earth, rock hammers, chisels, and pneumatic drills powered by portable compressors. Several tools lay scattered on the floor near the tunnel leading deeper underground. Their placement suggested they had been dropped suddenly, perhaps at the moment the collapse above occurred. The suddenness of their abandonment reinforced the impression that the group had fled in panic, realizing that the cave-in had exposed their entire operation. The team moved toward the far end of the chamber, where a narrow corridor led into an unexpectedly spacious alcove. Inside, they found something that sent a ripple of shock through their ranks. Against one wall stood a tall corkboard covered in pinned documents and printed pages. The papers were arranged in chaotic clusters, connected by strings and tape, forming networks of ideas resembling a conspiracy theorist's map of the universe. The closer they looked, the more disturbing the web became. The pinned documents included news clippings about alleged sightings near the base, blurry photographs of lights in the sky, grainy images purporting to show spacecraft, and heavily annotated printouts from fringe websites discussing theories about extraterrestrial life. Some papers contained transcripts of interviews with supposed witnesses. Others featured diagrams of alien anatomy, drawn with speculative imagination rather than scientific knowledge. Each piece connected to another with strings that formed lines radiating outward from a central pinned phrase, "Secrets buried below." The team stared in silence at this visual representation of the ideology driving the entire operation. There were notes about government suppression and deep underground vaults, all written in escalating handwriting, as though the writer had grown increasingly convinced of their mission. Some pages contained warnings. "We are running out of time. They cannot silence the truth forever," and "We must reach the vault before they relocate everything." These were not the thoughts of cold, calculated infiltrators, but of people who had descended deep into paranoia. The team understood now who they were dealing with. These were not spies. These were not saboteurs. They were zealots, radicalized civilians who believed they were fighting for humanity's right to know. Their actions were not driven by malice but by a distorted sense of purpose, and it was that sense of purpose that made them so dangerous. The next discovery came from a table tucked against the wall, where several digital devices lay in a tangled mess of wires and battery packs. Laptops, some with cracked screens, displayed folders named in cryptic sequences. Cameras stored images of tunnel sections and sketches referring to deeper parts of the restricted zone. There were flash drives, external hard drives, and memory cards labeled with markers such as proof_01, vault_entry, and evidence. But when the team opened the files, they discovered nothing but photos of blurry lights, distant aircraft, and vague silhouettes. The builders had believed they were uncovering definitive proof of extraterrestrial secrets, but their evidence was nothing more than ambiguous images fueled by confirmation bias. Yet, despite the lack of real proof, their conviction had only grown stronger. The team continued to compile information as they moved through the alcove. One corner held a metal cabinet containing additional records, meeting notes, timetables, and logs referencing excavation shifts. The logs indicated a systematic rotation of individuals, each taking turns digging and reinforcing tunnels. This operation had required not only conviction, but organization. The logs suggested the group had started with a small cluster of members and expanded as the work progressed. There were references to new volunteers joining, some messages written in encouraging tones, a community built around a shared mission. The final section of the chamber revealed a hidden compartment beneath a floor panel, concealed so cleverly it almost escaped notice. When the team lifted the panel, they found a set of documents sealed in a waterproof pouch. These pages contained perhaps the most vital information the group had guarded: plans for future expansion. One page revealed a sketched map of 3 additional tunnel routes, each aimed at different locations around the perimeter of the restricted zone. The lines were marked Phase 2, Phase 3, and Phase 4. Some sketches were mere outlines, but others showed partial digging schedules and intended entry points. The realization that the tunnel they had uncovered represented only the first stage of a larger network caused a heavy silence to settle over the team once more. This operation had only narrowly been prevented. The collapse had been an accident, a miscalculation on the builder's part, but without it, they would have continued burrowing deeper, expanding their access points, and potentially creating breaches in other sensitive locations. The scale of their ambition was far greater than they had initially feared. With each discovery, the team pieced together the psychological and logistical portrait of the group. They saw civilians who had lost themselves in the depths of their own theories, who had poured their time, money, and energy into an operation they believed would expose truth to the world. They had operated in secret, evading detection by working at night, disguising their surface structures as abandoned trailers, and hauling supplies discreetly across the desert. They had no military support, yet they had built something that nearly altered the course of national security. The team members felt a growing weight in their chests as they looked around the alcove, the cluttered evidence of a mission that had spiraled far beyond reason. They could not help but wonder what had driven these civilians to such extremes. Had they been motivated by fear, by hope, by some promise whispered among like-minded friends? Or had they descended into the depths of their own imaginations until the line between reality and fiction had blurred beyond recognition? The quiet in the chamber thickened as they took stock of the overwhelming evidence. These tunnels were not just pathways carved through stone. They were manifestations of belief. Dangerous, misguided belief that had almost resulted in catastrophic consequences. The group had not acted out of malice toward the base itself, but out of fervor to expose imagined truths buried underground. Their misguided dedication made them unpredictable and potentially capable of attempting another incursion if given the chance. With that unsettling thought, the team prepared to move deeper into the tunnel system. For despite everything they had found so far, they knew there was still more ahead. More chambers, more evidence, and perhaps the final answers about the group's actions. And somewhere beyond the next turn, the consequences of this underground world would continue to unfold, revealing not only the scope of the attempted breach, but also the lingering danger that escaped into the desert when the group fled in the wake of the collapse. The realization that the tunnel network extended far beyond the first chamber weighed heavily on the team as they prepared to advance into the remaining sections. The documents they had uncovered, the sketches marked Phase 2, Phase 3, and Phase 4, revealed an ambition so sweeping that it chilled even those accustomed to dealing with threats against national security. The scale of the operation was far greater than the team had imagined when they first stepped into the sinkhole. What had seemed at the start like a rogue excavation driven by a handful of obsessed individuals had now revealed itself to be a coordinated, long-term effort involving dozens of people working in secret toward a shared and dangerously misguided goal. The air in the tunnel felt thicker as they moved forward, almost as though the network itself resisted their discovery, reluctant to relinquish the secrets that had been carved into its bones. The tunnel stretched ahead, its path marked by footprints, smudges of dirt, and careful reinforcement that showed how deliberately the group had shaped it. The team passed through sections where beams had been newly installed, still bearing flecks of shiny metal at their joints. Other beams were older, dusted with the residue of months of work and faint traces of human touch. The lights from the team's helmets glinted off bolts that had been tightened meticulously with the same dedication a craftsman might bring to a labor of passion. That sense of obsessive intent clung to every surface, every shadow, reminding them of the fanaticism that had shaped this hidden world. It had been carved by hands driven not by orders, but by conviction. The path narrowed again, then opened into a corridor that showed signs of greater stress. Cracks ran along sections of the ceiling and walls, indicating where the earth had pressed harder than the builders anticipated. Scattered debris suggested the intruders had attempted to reinforce these areas, but had been forced to abandon the effort midway. Loose soil and fragments of rock littered the floor, requiring the team to move carefully as they pressed deeper into the network. They were acutely aware that the collapse above had destabilized portions of the tunnel system, and every sound of shifting earth echoed like a warning. Eventually, after a steady descent, the team reached a junction where the tunnel split in several directions. The left path had partially collapsed, its entrance blocked by fallen earth that was too precarious to clear without risking further destabilization. The right path was narrow, unfinished, and littered with unused materials. Bags of cement, metal rods, and wooden braces that had not yet been installed. The central path, however, was more developed. Its walls bore signs of wear from repeated contact, and the footprints leading into it were significantly more numerous. It was clear that this was the route the builders had used most frequently, and the team chose to follow it. The tunnel opened into a chamber larger than any they had encountered so far, a vast underground space carved with surprising architectural ambition. The ceiling rose high above them, supported by thick columns of reinforced concrete the intruders had poured themselves. The walls bore layers of geological strata, interrupted by patches of artificial reinforcement. It was a crude fusion of natural cavern and human construction, and it radiated an eerie sense of temporary permanence, as if the builders had intended it to serve as the heart of their operation. The air inside felt heavy and cold, and the buzzing of machinery from a distant corner reverberated against the vastness of the chamber. The team spread out to examine the space. Along one wall, several portable floodlights stood arranged in a row, though only one remained on, its beam flickering weakly in the dimness. Workbenches were scattered around the room covered in tools, spare parts, and half-finished devices. Piles of stone and earth rested beside industrial carts, some stacked neatly, others abandoned mid-use. The room felt frozen in time, as though the builders had left only minutes before the team arrived. Yet the silence made it impossible to imagine the chamber once bustling with activity. Near the center of the chamber was a set of larger tables upon which lay more detailed blueprints, sketches, and paper fragments. These documents were spread out with less order than in the earlier chambers, perhaps because the builders had been revising plans rapidly before their abrupt retreat. The largest diagram on the table was a cross-sectional illustration of the subterranean landscape between the base and Zone 51. It showed elevation lines, geological layers, and force vectors for controlled explosions. Certain areas had been circled in red, indicating points of structural weakness. Notes scribbled alongside detailed calculations provided instructions for the placement of explosives to maximize the likelihood of breaching interior walls without triggering a complete collapse. The team studied the diagrams intently, recognizing the unprecedented threat these plans represented. By using industrial-grade explosives in such proximity to restricted military infrastructure, the intruders risked not only destroying valuable archives and structural support systems, but also causing widespread damage to the sensitive equipment stored in deeper sectors. Had the builders succeeded, the resulting destruction might have compromised the very security of the region, creating gaps in the protective layers that shielded the restricted zone from unauthorized intrusion. It had not been a misguided attempt to uncover harmless secrets. It was an ideologically motivated act of intrusion that could have triggered a disaster. As the team examined the central chamber, the gravity of the situation grew clearer. They found maps detailing not only the original tunnel, but also rough plans for additional networks that branched away from the main route. These plans outlined excavation points at distant locations, some miles from the base, intended to serve as alternative entry points into the restricted area. Some were partially developed, indicated by subtle markings on the walls and ceilings of adjacent tunnels. Others had not yet been started but were marked on the maps with flourishes of intent. The builders had envisioned an entire underground system, a web of routes converging on sensitive areas, each designed to bypass different layers of detection and defense. The scale of the ambition was staggering. In the corner of the chamber, the team found another structure, a partitioned section created with metal sheets and salvaged materials. Behind this improvised barrier, they discovered a space that appeared to have been used as a private meeting area or command station. A small radio transmitter sat atop a stack of crates, its wires coiled like veins across the floor. Nearby, a folding table held a large binder filled with typed pages mixed with handwritten annotations. As the team flipped through the binder, they recognized it as a centralized compilation of the group's goals, strategies, and ideological foundations. Here, the intruders had documented their discussions, argued their theories, and clarified their objectives. It was a manifesto condensed into a manual, written with fervent conviction. The pages revealed a disturbing blend of half-remembered scientific concepts, speculation taken from unverified sources, and interpretations of historical events distorted to fit the group's narrative. Some entries mentioned alleged sightings and reports that had long been debunked. Others spoke of vaults containing extraterrestrial technology. There were claims that the government had reverse-engineered alien spacecraft and stored the remnants deep underground. These ideas had fueled their determination and shaped their plans for breaching the subterranean perimeter. The binder outlined multiple phases for the operation, including excavation, reinforcement, infiltration, and eventual extraction of evidence. It all pointed to a group so deeply embedded in their beliefs that no amount of rational information could have dissuaded them. One section of the binder contained communication logs between the group members. These logs referenced recruitment of new volunteers, coordination of excavation shifts, and strategies to avoid detection by satellite surveillance. The group had communicated through encrypted channels and used coded language to describe their progress. The logs also revealed tensions within the group, disagreements about tunnel placement, concerns about structural stability, and fears that their operation might be discovered prematurely. The collapse above must have felt like an inevitable disaster to them, confirming their fears and prompting their sudden flight. Realizing the significance of the binder, the team secured it carefully. It held not only insight into the group's ideology, but also potential evidence that could assist in identifying and locating its members. The binder's final pages contained a section labeled Contingencies, listing escape routes, fallback locations, and alternative methods of infiltration should their primary tunnel be compromised. The implications were chilling. The group had considered multiple ways to continue their mission even if discovered. They had planned to regroup, rebuild, and try again. As the team continued through the central chamber, they found evidence that the builders had attempted to establish secondary access points. Narrow passages branched off in various directions, though many were still in early stages of excavation. These unfinished tunnels revealed the group's ambition to create redundancies in their network, ensuring that if one tunnel failed, others would remain viable. Some branch points were marked with chalk lines indicating intended depth and direction, while others bore hastily written notes encouraging the team to continue after breach. The evidence suggested that the group had not been discouraged by obstacles, but had instead adapted their plans as they encountered challenges. The team followed one of the partially completed branches until they reached an area where the builders had clearly encountered difficulties. The tunnel ended abruptly in a section of unusually dense rock. The walls bore the marks of repeated attempts to break through with drills and chisels, but the progress had been slow. Abandoned tools lay scattered across the floor, some damaged from overuse. The team paused here, recognizing that the builders had been pushing themselves to their limits, driven by an unrelenting desire to uncover what they believed lay ahead. Returning to the main chamber, the team examined the final corner, a narrow alcove that might easily have gone unnoticed without careful inspection, but its significance became apparent almost immediately. A hidden compartment lay beneath a metal plate bolted into the floor. When the team removed the bolts and lifted the panel, they discovered a weatherproof case containing the additional documents referenced earlier. These were the plans for the 3 more tunnel systems the builders intended to dig. The sketches were crude but detailed enough to reveal entry points, excavation strategies, and intended targets. They also included notes expressing hope that these tunnels would be proof of concept, a phrase that revealed the builders' intention to continue probing deeper into the restricted zone, regardless of risk or consequence. The team knew that securing this evidence was critical. These plans represented future threats, attempts that could still be carried out by the individuals who had abandoned the tunnels. The collapse had halted them for now, but nothing in the documents suggested they had given up. Their writings spoke repeatedly of resilience, of continuing until the truth was revealed. These were people who would retreat only to regroup, and the team understood that unless they were identified and apprehended, the threat would linger like a shadow beneath the desert. With the chamber thoroughly examined, the team prepared to begin the process of neutralizing the tunnel system. They knew it would require careful coordination. They had to ensure that the explosive materials were safely removed, the reinforced structures systematically dismantled, and the tunnels collapsed in controlled sections to prevent further underground instability. The team contacted the surface to request reinforcements, demolition experts, structural engineers, and additional personnel. They relayed the significance of what had been discovered and emphasized the need for immediate action. There could be no delay in securing the site. In the following hours, teams began arriving to assist in the complex task of clearing the tunnels. The explosives were cataloged, neutralized, and transported to secure containment areas. The diagrams, binders, notebooks, and digital devices were gathered as evidence, each item carefully packed to preserve its forensic integrity. Engineers evaluated the tunnel system, identifying points that required immediate reinforcement before controlled collapse could begin. The team coordinated with these experts, guiding them through the network and highlighting areas of concern. As the work progressed, another layer of operational complexity revealed itself. The personnel tasked with securing the site had to navigate the challenge of dismantling a structure designed with secrecy in mind. Many of the tunnels were inherently unstable due to the rushed and unconventional methods used by the builders. Some passages were too narrow for large equipment, requiring delicate work with portable gear. Others were too dangerous to enter at all, forcing the team to create controlled collapses from a distance. At the same time, intelligence units began compiling profiles based on the evidence collected. The DNA samples, fingerprints, and personal items left behind provided leads. Surveillance teams were mobilized to investigate known radicalized groups and online communities devoted to conspiracy theories. Though the team knew it would take time to identify the individuals responsible, they had enough information to begin building a picture of the group's membership and operations. When the site was finally stabilized and the last of the dangerous materials removed, the process of collapsing the tunnels began. Engineers detonated charges at key structural points to ensure sections collapsed inward safely. The ground trembled as planned cave-ins sealed off chambers one by one. Dust filled the air, and the cracks left behind in the surface marked the end of the tunnel network's existence. Each collapse felt like the symbolic closing of a door, a closure for a threat that had emerged from shadows beneath the desert. On the surface, officials began preparing reports that would never be seen by the public. The official explanation would be a geological collapse caused by a shift in Earth, an event chalked up to natural processes rather than human intent. The truth, that a group of radical civilians had built an elaborate network beneath a military base, would remain classified, locked in secure files accessible only to a few authorized individuals. The public would never learn how close their government had come to facing an unprecedented underground breach. Yet, even as the tunnels were destroyed, one truth remained clear. The group responsible for this operation remained at large, their identities unknown, their intentions unresolved. The notes they left behind suggested they still believed in their mission. Their conviction had not been extinguished by the collapse. It had merely been interrupted. The team knew that somewhere out in the desert or beyond, the individuals who had carved these tunnels might already be planning their next move. As the last section of the tunnel system fell silent beneath tons of crushed earth and reinforced debris, the magnitude of the discovery lingered in the minds of those who had walked its corridors. They had witnessed firsthand the power of belief twisted into obsession, the danger posed by those convinced they alone possessed the truth. The tunnels were gone, but the ideology that had spawned them was not. It whispered in the pages of the notebooks, echoed in the sketches of future tunnels, and lived in the minds of the people who had fled into the night. And though the desert above lay quiet once more, the team could not shake the sense that beneath that silence, beneath the shifting sands and fractured earth, the story was far from over. Before you go, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, and check out the next stories waiting for you. Your support